What's up, everybody? Derek Lambert, Myth Vision Podcast. I'm here with James Fodor. Welcome, James.
Thanks, it's a pleasure.
And is it safe to say Dr. Fodor?
Well, I don't know about safe. It's correct to say that. Yes, I completed my PhD last year.
I didn't want to be rude and say anything you didn't want me to say, but I also...
No, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so Dr. Fodor, if you don't mind, can you describe your background, your expertise, and maybe even hint at a little bit about your YouTube and stuff like that and your books so people can understand a little bit more of who you are and what you've done?
Sure, sounds good. So my background is a little bit unusual, I guess. So I'm a cognitive scientist, so I do work in language and the brain, I think broadly speaking, and the nature of computation, so sort of large language models, studying how the brain processes meaning. My interest in sort of philosophy and religion dates back to when I was a teenager, I guess. I grew up as a Mormon, so Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I actually served a mission for that, if people know what that refers to. So like going out and preaching full-time for quite a while. And that was a formative experience for me, growing up in the church and preaching there. And I sort of actually, once I got back from that, I did some further reading online, and this was around 2010. So the internet was like somewhat new, especially sort of social media and people sharing a lot of information about different topics about religion and like the origins of Mormonism, the Book of Mormon and things like that. So I did a bunch of reading and decided that was almost certainly false, a lot of what I believed. And that led me to then thinking about, well, what do I believe? How do I reshape my worldview? And that encompasses many things like ethics and metaphysics and philosophy of science and things like this. So that's been a journey that I've been on for, I guess, 25-ish years now. And these days I call myself an atheist, a naturalist, and a skeptic, if we want to use labels. Humanist as well is another one. So I became interested in interfaith dialogue and engaging with the Christian groups on campus, just mostly like mainline Protestant groups, evangelicals. I should say I'm from Australia, so this is where this happened, but the discourse isn't dramatically different, to be honest there, but little different, but like similar issues. Anyway, so I engaged with quite a number of Christians there and made some good friends, but it's there that I came into contact with sort of, I guess, Protestant evangelical apologetics, which I didn't really know anything about prior to this. And particularly William Lane Craig, who was obviously a prominent apologist, and a number of the friends that I made or other acquaintances were telling me about his like cosmological argument and the moral argument, and particularly the resurrection argument, which was one that I was particularly interested in because it had a lot of aspects that related to history and I guess like psychology or cognition. It's fundamentally an argument about what people believe or what it would be reasonable for them to believe given the context. So I sort of took it upon myself to write a book-length response to William Lane Craig, specifically his Apologetics, which no one had done up to that point, to my knowledge. People had written many responses to particular aspects, but so mine is the first book-length response to all of his main arguments. And in there, I developed a approach specifically to his resurrection argument, which I call the RHBS model, which I think we'll talk about more at length. But essentially, that's an approach from broadly cognitive science, psychology, to understand how the belief in the risen Jesus could have arisen without appealing either to miracles or sort of deliberate fraud. So that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. And for the last, 5 or 6 years now, I've been producing YouTube content, mostly like reviewing apologetics videos. I have the series Bad Apologetics with Nathan Ormond. And also my own channel, which you can see here, a variety of some debates and also videos where I review different apologetics channels and mostly highlight the weaknesses of their approaches. So I generally take a sort of strongly scientific, critical thinking approach to things. So yeah, for example, that video on substance dualism, where I discuss some of the issues with the coherence of substance dualism as a position and how it relates to science and things like that. So that's kind of what I do on my channel.
Wow. Go subscribe. I've pinned this in the comment section for everybody. Let's get those numbers up for James here, if you don't mind. I'd like to see him grow. I'd like more people to think through these scientific and philosophical topics, and of course, contra apologetic type of ideas, things that are showing other ways to explain the data. And I really enjoy that you're approaching it through a scientific lens. I try to treat every faith equally in the sense of they're not all, I'm not saying that identical in terms of how to assess them. But like I try to treat them fairly equally is what I mean, and understand. Usually I'm looking at it like Scooby Doo, and it's like where take them, try to find, you know, who's behind it, what's going on, and what maybe is driving the cause behind these religions. And so your work actually interests me. So if anyone wants to get the book should be in the description. Subscribe to his YouTube channel. I want to talk to you a little bit about how you've come to understand the resurrection and doing it through this scientific lens. We do have a super chat now. Let's take super chats as we go if you're cool with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Dan, thank you so much for the super chat. Really appreciate it and being a member. Resurrection happened just like Muhammad flew on his winged horse to Jerusalem. He resurrected, never to be seen or heard again. Makes total sense.
Well, I think this is the right way to think about this, because this is and this is sort of the answer to your question as well. What I recommend, the approach that I recommend taking is to think about alternative explanations of what we regard as the facts. The facts would be something like the gospel accounts and what Paul has to say, and maybe a few other like later non-Christian mentions, but like fundamentally it's sort of the gospel accounts, as well as the development of the early Christian church. And we know that it spread from Jerusalem around that time. So like those are uncontested facts that those things happened or exist. So then the question is, how can we account for these? And what I advocate for is a sort of a contrastive approach where people develop different explanatory hypotheses, and then we evaluate them on their explanatory merit. So that's things like, how much does it explain? How plausible is it? How well does it explain the data? And it's important to do this in as comprehensive and consistent as way as we can. And this is one of the fundamental problems that I try to highlight with apologetic approaches, is because overwhelmingly in my experience, like Craig does this, I had a debate with Jimmy Akin about the resurrection, he did this, and others that I've spoken to. What they do is they critique alternative hypotheses, like naturalistic hypotheses, and highlight limitations and flaws in them. The thing is that any explanatory hypothesis has weaknesses. Unless you are omniscient and know all of the facts, there's always going to be a weakness, right? There's always things that we don't quite understand or extrapolations we have to make. So identifying flaws in an explanation is not in itself that interesting. What you have to do is contrast those flaws to the explanatory virtues of a hypothesis and compare that to rivals. So the thing is, Christians say that Jesus resurrected to vindicate his conquest of death, right? So does it make sense that he would appear just to a few of his followers for couple of weeks and then disappear forever? Now, I contend that it doesn't make sense. That is not actually what you would expect. Christians are used to that account, but it's not actually very coherent. And so then we should contrast that with alternative hypotheses that could account not just for why the appearances happened, but also why they happened only to certain people and only for a certain amount of time, in addition to a wide variety of other data. So I think that it's actually really important to, in a sense, like take the Christian accounts seriously as explanatory hypotheses, thereby showing the weaknesses that they have.
Right. I love that, the way you're approaching it. And I do think it's interesting the way Dan asked the super chat. Great question, or statement question, if you will. I'm
just going to shut my window. There's some noise in the background.
Yeah, no worries. Yep. Dan, this brings up Richard C. Miller to me and others that I've studied who highlight, isn't it ironic that he makes this real grand appearance? In fact, we should probably have James hear this. So James, I actually feel like this is something that'd be funny for you to hear that is relevant to the super chat. And I think it is Richard Miller, who I was mentioning. Check out his work when you get a chance. Who and others who just find it kind of odd. He makes this like appearance, and of course selectively, but then gone, unfalsifiably disappears. Oh yeah, he's gone into heaven. Like when we read about other legends or other stories, Heracles' body is missing from, the bones aren't there in the fire, or there's always this missing body trope, which is why I recommend checking that out on Richard C. Miller. He documents, he uses about 78 cases in chapter 2 of ancient Greek heroes. And of course, goddesses, women who've become goddesses and men, and like all like deification type of scenes, some historical, some mythical. And in them, he jots 15 examples of these translation themes that are like well-known themes in these ancient Greek stories.
Yes, I've heard of some of these.
50 something of the 78, the body goes missing. The tomb is empty. You know what I'm saying? Like, and we have like contemporaneous, like, what is it? Callerton's, is it Callerton? Yeah. The novel that has the missing body. Have you heard about that one in the first century?
No, I haven't.
Let me pull it up here. It's Callerton's novel. Hold on. First century novel, missing body from tomb. It's a man in the story. The man thinks he killed his wife. He buries her or puts her in a tomb. And next day he comes back and, he's remorsing and he sees that the tomb is open and she's not in there, but she didn't really die. He thought he killed her. Well, as soon as he does, he makes this exclamation in the story and he's like, "Oh my gosh, you gods, you envied me that I was married to a goddess all along." So there's this like cultural trope idea that if their body goes missing, they are a god, they are divine. And I find that quite ironic to know that the mind, like how that mind worked back then. Yeah, Chariton's Chareas, I always butcher this, Chaereas, and Callerho, Callirhoe. It's a Greek novel, usually dated to the 1st century of the Common Era, often described as the earliest fully extant ancient romance. It has striking open tomb missing body scene. Chareas goes to the tomb. Anyway, you kind of got a gist, but come to find out, it was actually pirates who took her and to a faraway land. He has no clue that she's not dead, or that hasn't been taken by the gods. So I just think it's interesting too, though, that he's there and then he's gone. And it's like, when we say, and I say to Christian apologists all the time, many of them are my friends, I say, look, I'm like doubting Thomas. Like, you want to persuade me, I could be convinced, but I'm not holding my breath. And I'm pretty convinced that this is more legendary in nature, or at least psychological in nature. If we go down that path in some way to try and explain origins here, it might be a mixture. And I imagine you have something of a mixture, but he's not, you can't falsify, you can't prove it. That's the problem. He's disappeared. He's gone.
Yes, and I think that it is hard to make sense of the Christian claim that the purpose of the appearances was to vindicate Jesus' triumph over death, when it doesn't do any vindication to anyone except people who already sort of believed him, like his disciples. That's really unexpected, and this is a point that I make frequently in discussions about this, that really what you would expect, given that Jesus's salvific mission is for all of mankind, you would expect him to vindicate himself to all of mankind. Interestingly, the Mormons believe that Jesus appeared to peoples in the ancient Americas, which I think kind of, not that there's any evidence for this, but like kind of makes sense that he would do that, as well as people in like China and India and elsewhere in the world, in order to have well, first of all, like, would clearly rule out most naturalistic hypotheses. If you have these sort of simultaneous appearances of culturally distinct elements that don't exist, that didn't previously exist in that cultural setting, that then appear simultaneously in different places in the world, that cannot be explained through contact. That would be very convincing to later peoples, as well as at the time, leading to the establishment of, like correct worship or correct theology or whatever in different parts of the world. Like that just seems to be much more coherent, consistent with what Christian doctrine actually says God's objectives are. But what I find is that there is very little that constrains supernatural type explanations, precisely because, especially when God's involved, God is omnipotent, so we can do anything. So when a certain effect needs to be accounted for, apologists will just say, oh, well, God did it that way, or God brought it about. But then when you ask, well, why did you do it this way and why not some other way? Usually they just don't care and they just don't have anything to say. They just change the topic, or they just don't think it needs an answer. But actually, if like you can explain anything that way, there's nothing special about Jesus' resurrection. I could explain like the weather by appeal to the vicissitudes of the gods, which like people did in the past. But like we haven't disproven that the gods caused the weather, right? We have other accounts that don't require that, but like you can't disprove that gods are involved. It's impossible. It's unfalsifiable. So literally anything could be explained if you invoke enough postulates of supernatural beings or other processes. The point is, not to like falsify those because it's impossible. The point is to, can we develop explanations that are better than those, that are more parsimonious and more explanatory? And I think that there's a wide range of possibilities in the case of the origin of Christianity. And relating to your point, I take my account, the RHBS model takes the empty tomb to be historical. And that's not because necessarily I think there was an empty tomb. It's just to highlight that there's different approaches you can take, and that Christian apologists often treat it as if when the skeptic is forced to grant, or like if they can force the skeptic to grant the empty tomb, and like the disciples believed that they had that Jesus appeared to them, then you're forced to grant the reality of the resurrection. And the point of the RHBS model is to just show, well, that's not true at all. Like even if you grant almost all of the things that they claim to be able to show, nothing whatever follows about Jesus's resurrection. So my model is not a claim about what happened. It's a claim that it's really an attempt to illustrate the explanatory weaknesses of supernatural explanations.
Isn't that historical investigation though? Because at the end of the day, we have no way to know exactly what happened. And so you have to like weigh out, rule out, compare, measure to see what probability makes better sense. And if there are more plausible explanations, for me, the miraculous would be the least, based on a prior probability scale in my mind. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm curious to get your mind on this, because they don't like that. But it's like, hold on. What makes it so special is that it isn't this common thing happening. We see the natural phenomena that roll in front of our eyes on a day-to-day basis. We're supposed to go, this is unique. This isn't, wow, it rained. Or, oh my gosh, that's cool and all, but that's not a dude who died and rose again a few days later.
Well, this is a fundamental weakness of the apologetic strategies, and this really came out in my debate with Jimmy Akin. So he was arguing, so my RHBS model claims that the Jesus's body was initially laid to rest by Joseph of Arimathea in his tomb, and then after the Sabbath, their body was removed and placed in a common burial site somewhere. And then basically the women disciples came, they found the tomb empty, they didn't know that the body had been removed, that triggered a hallucination, and then they went and told the other disciples. They had then group appearances of Jesus appearing to them, which then through memory distortions and confabulations and cognitive distortions then gradually developed into the accounts that we have in the Gospels. That's the gist of what my model says. But now the point is, Jimmy Akin was saying, look, the idea that Jesus's body would be removed from the tomb, it's pretty unlikely because they didn't normally remove bodies from tombs, right? And he's right about that. They don't normally remove bodies from tombs. And likewise, the idea that the Jesus's disciples had a collective, hallucinatory experience. He's like, well, maybe that could have happened, but it doesn't happen that often. Like it's a sort of a rare event. And that was his point. It's like the things that I'm postulating are rare and require a certain confluence of circumstances, right? And I completely grant that. Like, I'm not trying to explain a common event. I'm trying to explain a relatively rare event. World religions don't emerge all the time. Like there are lots of new religious movements, but most of them don't catch on or don't become very large. So clearly the origin of Christianity is going to be a unique event and relatively rare in what happened. But here's the point that the apologists don't seem to get. They are claiming that the resurrection of Jesus is a unique historical event. It is like the most important and unique, unprecedented and unparalleled event in all of human history. So what they can't do is reject my explanation or an alternative naturalistic explanation on the basis that it is postulating rare or unusual events, because they are postulating the ultimately most rare and unusual event. What they have to establish is that we have more reason to think that their rare event happened compared to an alternate relatively rare scenario. Right. And I think that there's much more reason to favor my explanation, or indeed other alternative naturalistic hypothesis, than their explanation, because I think their explanation is entirely ad hoc. But there's this sort of bait and switch where they say, oh, well, your explanation is implausible because the things you're suggesting don't normally happen. But people don't normally come back from the dead either. In fact, we don't know of any examples where that's happened, whereas we do know examples where bodies are moved and where people make mistakes and where people have hallucinations and where people have memory contaminations. All of the things that I postulate are known to happen. Mm-hmm. And there's various contextual reasons why we think that they're more likely to happen together, because a lot of them, one triggers the next, right? Finding the empty tomb then triggers a hallucination, which then triggers more hallucinations effectively. So there's a logic to that account. Whereas in the case of the resurrection hypothesis, I don't see much of a logic to the account at all. It's not clear why Jesus would be expected to be the Messiah. He doesn't seem to meet the criteria of the Messiah based on the Old Testament. It's not clear why we would expect the Messiah to be resurrected. This is something that people like Craig have pointed out, that resurrection was not an idea that was associated. Well, the resurrection would happen at the end of the world when everything would be renewed and God's word like fully restored and spread throughout the world, but not like it wouldn't. There was no connection between the Messiah being resurrected for our sins in the middle of history or anything like that. That's a Christian notion. That's not a pre-existing Jewish notion. So that seems very ad hoc. And then there's the appearances, which, well, just because Jesus rose from the dead, that doesn't mean he would appear to everyone. And in fact, he can appear to people without that being a resurrection appearance. Like he appeared to Paul after he'd already allegedly like risen to heaven. And there were like visionary accounts of him appearing to other people later on as well, like that are recorded in Acts that are after his ascension. So this is the point. Jesus can resurrect without appearing to people, and he can appear to people without resurrecting. So it doesn't seem like there's any connection between the appearances and the resurrection. So we've just got another ad hoc element to the account, and then we have to account for why he didn't appear to other people and why he stopped appearing after it was.
You broke up? Uh-oh. Did he break up? Am I the one? Everyone in the chat, press 1, please. Let me know that if you can hear me and it's not me. Press 1 and say, we hear you. I think we lost James for a moment, or I'm either. Okay, so it's not me. Paul, Victor. Okay, this is getting good. He broke up. Oh, there he is. There he is. Sorry, James. I was checking out what was going on. I guess he broke up.
That was just my internet being dumb.
No worries. We thought that you had ascended to heaven for a moment there. I was getting a little worried that we might be wrong all along. So where were you? You were saying something about 10 seconds, maybe 12 seconds prior to you glitching.
So I was saying how there's no clear connection between Jesus resurrecting and Jesus appearing to people, because he can do that with or without resurrecting. And likewise, there's no clear reason why he would appear just to people who already knew him, or why he would ascend to heaven after 40 days. So all of the aspects of the account seem to me just to be entirely ad hoc, invented to account for the details as they were recorded. That it doesn't seem to be a very coherent story. And therefore, I don't really think that we should regard it as plausible at all. One of the things that I try to challenge apologists with is to explain why we should think that their theory is plausible. But they seem to, at least in my experience, they never want to do this. All they want to do is criticize alternative theories, not tell us why we should believe their theory.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's called, what is your acronyms?
RHBS. So that just stands for the key elements of the model. So reburial, hallucinations, biases, and socialization.
Gotcha. Okay, so what you're doing, just to lay your cards out on the table for the viewer who may have missed this, is you're saying, look, I've watched a lot of William Lane Craig, Frank Turek, Ravi Zacharias, whoever they might be, that has made these arguments about the resurrection, specifically Craig, because your book is targeting him. And I think when I was a Christian, I went and downloaded and bought the CDs back then. I bought every debate that guy ever did, even his like private sessions and college. He'd show up at a college and preach. He was like, him and Ravi Zacharias were my two favorite apologists. This was before the massage scandal came out. And
I was going to say, you really pick him.
I know. I didn't. Hey, look, I can't help it. He was poetic, and I liked that about him. And then William Lane Craig was much more analytical. And that made me feel like, ooh, I'm smart because he's smart, because we're smart, because we have an intellectual who can prove this. And we're like, in good company with the smartest people. So I felt like my faith could be proven almost. Like I felt as a Christian, at least, it could be so confidently obvious that if your brain cells were just, IQ was high enough, you would realize how true this is and just believe. It's almost like it felt like that. Maybe that's just me being funny.
I think that's the main purpose of apologetics.
Really?
Yeah, it's to make people feel comfortable in their faith, either for people who, for some people, it's to stop them from leaving the faith if they have doubts. They go and they hear someone who is articulate, confidently pronounce and sound smart about, we have answers to these things. And it doesn't really matter what the answer is for most people. It's just that, well, they have an answer and they are not worried by this and they're smart, so I don't have to worry about it either. So that's the person who might be doubting. The person who's not, it's sort of reaffirming, and they feel confident and affirmed in their faith, and so that they don't leave. I don't think apologetics is really designed to convince people who are really skeptical. I mean,
right,
there are exceptions, but for the most part, I think that I think of it as a sort of an the intellectual PR side of Christianity. Like there's many aspects of Christianity that attempt to attract people or maintain people. There are certain type of people for whom this intellectual side is important. I think it's a minority of Christians, but there's still a significant number of them. And most people want to feel, at least to some degree, that their faith is justified, whether they spend a lot of time actually thinking about it. People don't want to feel a fool, right? Or they want to think that they actually believe the truth. So having an apologet, I sort of talk about this. I mean, this is a bit anecdotal, but it's like apologetics as a kind of a veneer of intellectual protection, essentially. Like you're a bit more into it probably than most. Some people will have like the apologetics book, like Lee Strobel, the book on the shelf or whatever, that like maybe they've looked through, or maybe they watch a debate now and then. There's the apologetics friend down at church who like knows more about this stuff, and they talk to them sometimes if they have like doubts or whatever. And so these sort of ideas like proliferate out through the culture and serve to like intellectually undergird and make people feel safer in their belief. That's my anecdotal sort of pop psychology view about the purpose of apologetics. And what I want to do is try to crack through that and show like it's kind of all a facade. Like these ideas are all just really poorly defined and defended and poorly substantiated. So I'm not trying to deconvert people as such. If people want to continue in their belief, that's their business, right?
Right.
But I want people to have a proper understanding of things and be able to think through things critically in terms of like the history, the psychology, the science, the philosophy, and all those aspects. So that's my objective. And the RHBS model is designed to facilitate that, because there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, I think, that Craig and others do, Habermas and so forth, about the resurrection. Which I think is just really unjustified. So I try to cut through a lot of that and say, look, I'm going to grant nearly everything that you actually spend time arguing about, and contend that even so, the resurrection is a terrible explanation. So I'm just going to grant empty tomb, and I'm going to grant that the apostles all believed sincerely to have seen Jesus appear to them. And even some of my more recent work, I'll even grant like original authorship of all the gospels, like even though I think that's ridiculous. But like I actually think that the resurrection hypothesis is so bad as an explanation that you can grant almost everything, and you still don't get there. You still don't get that to be the most plausible explanation. And that's what I'm really trying to emphasize. I'm not actually saying that I know what happened historically. I'm saying that when we're contrasting explanations, you really have to be able to show why yours is superior to another. And I think that what apologists do is they bamboozle people by talking about anything other than the resurrection. They talk about gospel authorship. They talk about gospel reliability. They talk about comparative mythology and like the Greek myths and things like this.
Martyrdom of the saints.
Yeah, they talk about martyrdom. Exactly. They talk about Paul and how you interpret this or that Greek word. There's a place for those things, but I think that a lot of that is a distraction, because none of these things are actually the resurrection. What I want to talk about is, why do you think that the resurrection is the best explanation of these set of facts? And I don't think that they actually have non-circular answers to this.
Wow.
And so that's what I'm trying to emphasize with what I do.
Okay, I've never heard it from the horse's mouth. By the way, I don't know if you know our buddy Steven from the Skeptically Agnostic channel.
I don't think so.
Okay, he's got a YouTube channel. I think it's called
Skeptically Agnostic.
Yeah, the Skeptical Agnostic, Steven. Skeptical Agnostic. Anyway, we did a show, and Testify popped on. The Skeptical Agnostic. He's got like 1,003. It looks like 1.3K subscribers.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few of his videos before.
Yeah, he liked your model and actually used it one day when we had a call in. And so you're making some trends here, at least playing. Because here's the thing, like for me, and I want to get to the super chat too. I don't want to leave anybody hanging who's helping support the channel. But like, I would like to get into some other things too with you. And first, I want to dive into your model and like some of the details of where you might explain some of the data and why other alternatives make better sense to you. But then I'd also like to go before we even get in the sandbox with them, because I have a different, like, you would agree with me. Like, we should be able to do all of these. I think as someone who is trying to really wrap their heads around, I want to play in the sandbox with a believer who might be sitting across from me, because I enjoy engaging and meeting them where they're at. But then I also, before you even begin, I have real concerns about what we're even reading. What is this material? And I know that a lot of mainstream critical scholars just kind of grant a lot of this as history, but I know a lot of PhDs who don't. And I'm not talking about mythicists, which I know is not a predominant, like a majority view at all. It's a definitely minority position. I'm talking about people who think there's a historical Jesus. obviously we're not just talking about the empty tomb. I'm talking about even in Paul, like Richard C. Miller, I've been bringing up with you, that part of cults, like if we use these models, these scientific explanations, then we need to run to the imperial cult, and we need to then grant and explain those visionary experiences where people swore and testify in court of the eyewitnesses they saw. But then we can also run to other legendary or mythic material where it never happened. And there is an appearance of Romulus who shows up to, a very noble man who's honest and good and swears that he came and told him he's Quirinius and tells him a great commission to go tell all of Rome. Like, so I just like, I like what you're doing because you're meeting them where they're at. But then I also like going, we're granting you too much too sometimes. Like at the end of the day, I don't even know what's fair.
Well, so here's my position on this. So I developed this approach in large part because I saw most people arguing with Craig about, well, I say Craig, but like also other, Craig doesn't like to use the term minimal facts, but from what I can tell, what he does is indistinguishable from a Habermas or Lacona minimal facts. So that's what I call it. But anyway, I heard most people who disputed him, they argue with him about which of his facts are like actual facts, like the empty tomb, for example, or whether the disciples did have collective experiences or whether it was just like Peter or someone who had a private experience. So I don't have a problem with that, but I just felt like there was a missing angle to this, which is like, even if you grant all these things, I don't think the resurrection follows at all. In fact, I think that there are, we can explain it just through like hallucinations and cognitive distortions. So that's why I developed the account as an alternative approach, which I think was underexplored. And I still think probably is underexplored in the sort of debate discussion space about this. But that doesn't mean that I think that other approaches shouldn't be discussed as well. I think that it's very important and useful to have other aspects. This is what I focus on for two reasons. One is that I'm not a biblical scholar, and so I don't really have qualifications to like go through the passages and interpret what is likely historical and who said what and what they meant here. So that's not really my area. Cognitive science is more my area, so I approach it from that angle. And secondly, because I think it's underexplored, underappreciated, and I think that it's worth sharing this sort of approach and way of thinking about things. But I'm certainly not saying that we should always just make all these, like grant all these things that I do. I do that for the sake of argument to illustrate certain points, partly because I think that believers won't have heard this approach before, and even many skeptics haven't heard this approach before. And it's useful to have different ways of thinking about things. Because if you are someone who does believe that the historical evidence provides a convincing case for the resurrection, you have to have something to say about models like mine, which are more psychological based. But then you also have to just defend the facts initially. And I don't even deal with that side of it. So like, it's sort of a 1-2 punch, if you like. Like, I think that they have to deal with people who critique that aspect of it. But then even if they can establish those things, then they have to get around, well, what about the psychological, cognitive science aspects of it? And of course, there's a spectrum, like many people can take different approaches. So I'm very much of the view that it's important to have different approaches to these things, to highlight different weaknesses of the apologetic case. And so I do that from my perspective, which is more related to my expertise, as well as just an area that I thought was underappreciated.
Yeah, I want to get into that too. Specifically, each little apologetic. Maybe you can give us some highlights. Real Daniel, I think. Yeah, thank you so much for the super chat. Would you agree with Professor Marcus Vincent that resurrection belief was not a universally early Christian belief, but a Pauline belief? So I haven't studied Marcus Vincent's work. I imagine this is targeted at me because I don't think you probably know who Marcus Vincent is.
Not by name, although I know somewhat about this controversy.
Oh, okay. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you
want.
No,
I don't have a particular well-developed position. My general view is that early Christian belief was highly heterogeneous, and the extent to which it conformed with modern doctrinal beliefs, I think, is greatly exaggerated by the apologists. Now, sort of that being said, I usually focus just on granting as much as they want and still showing that, like, okay, well, suppose they all did believe in the resurrection. Does that make it likely? Well, no, because we can account for another means. But like, I don't actually think that most Christians, even the disciples, I don't think that they had a well-developed view about this. To what extent Paul was critical, I don't know. It does seem like that he was very influential in developing, like, doctrinally the sort of proto-Orthodox understanding. But I don't have a very fine-grained view about this, other than like, I guess I would just caveat that, like, often I don't get into these sorts of discussions because it's not my area of expertise, but people may mistake the positions that I take for the sake of argument as my actual position. So like, for example, I may take for the sake of argument the position that of original authorship of all of the Gospels, but that doesn't mean I actually think that that's likely. I think it's incredibly unlikely, but I think it can be useful as a rhetorical strategy to highlight other weaknesses in the accounts.
Right. So yeah, just I guess directed. I haven't read Marcus Vincent's book specifically on this question. I don't know what to say about this idea of whether or not a resurrection belief was there. I think if I were to make any guess, the atonement idea, Christ crucified as an atonement, that theology I think was Pauline. I don't think that stretches it back before Paul. I have no way to prove it, but I am of the opinion that Paul has a unique revelation that he has, and no one has given that to him but Christ, and anyone who has a different gospel from him. There seem to be other types of gospel messages that were floating around, and his unique one, I think, was atonement theology. He wants to hear Christ crucified, and I don't think anyone else had that kind of model. I cannot prove it again, but that's my speculation. So resurrection and atonement theology is different, though, than resurrection, and people can conflate them, but no, even Paul, I mean, Luke's theology is more resurrection focused, Luke Acts, versus Paul's, which is more atonement idea. Not to say he didn't think he rose, but it's more central at the sacrificial level. And that's a whole different thing. So that's my opinion. I haven't really dug into Marcus Vincent's work, so I'm being honest. I really have no way to say. He could be right. I'm always open to hearing what scholars have to say. And Marcus is not only a great gentleman, but a brilliant man. Thank you so much for that super chat. So I'd like to play a game then, because you can really wear the hat, and I want to play from, let's just assume, all right, we're dealing with the Gospels at face value. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, gets it captured in the garden, trial, all of this stuff has got so many question marks and iffies and all that kind of stuff. Gets himself, killed, and he's crucified, and then boom. Take us from the crucifixion in a completely naturalistic explanation world. If you were to hypothetically roll out, we were watching a new film. Tomorrow, Mel Gibson's new Resurrection movie rolled out, and simultaneously so did James Fodor's video. and they got to see the two different movies in action. What's your movie look like?
Yeah, so my account sort of builds on the idea that the Romans were very concerned, well, the Jewish authorities as well, particularly the Romans, were very concerned about public disorder. And this is well attested historically. We know that the Romans had continual problems with uprisings of the Jews. And again, if you take the gospel accounts at face value, and this aspect I think is plausible, that there was a lot of discontent around the public trial of Jesus, and real potential for that to develop into a riot. So the Gospels tell us that Jesus was still on the cross relatively late on Friday afternoon. John says, because of the day of Jewish preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. And my reburial, I didn't invent the idea of reburial, but the way that I characterize it builds off of this idea that there was a need to remove Jesus's body from the cross to, in accordance with Jewish law, that you shouldn't have those during the Sabbath, as well as a second requirement to do that quickly because it was close to the Sabbath, but also to take it somewhere that was relatively private, so as to avoid or reduce the risk of further protest or upheaval. And so these were the overwhelming Roman priority was to just get this done and keep it quiet as much as they could to reduce tensions, and to particularly over the Passover, they wanted to make sure that the upheaval would be kept to a minimum. So the hypothesis is that Joseph of Arimathea, who had a tomb that was nearby, either volunteered or perhaps was volunteered by others, shall we say, to offer his tomb for the purpose. So there's two versions. One is that it depends if you believe that he was sort of sympathetic to Jesus or not. I'm happy to go either way on this. I think you can account for it either way. Let's suppose that he wasn't really sympathetic to Jesus, and that was a later development. In which case, he could have just been sort of impressed upon by the Romans and the Jewish authorities to lend his new family tomb as a temporary storage place for Jesus's body just over the Sabbath, and then they'll move it after that. He wouldn't have been very happy about this. having a convicted criminal in his tomb, but like the Roman authorities wanted an uprising even less, and so he was pressed into doing it. That is why, as soon as the Sabbath was over on Saturday evening, he removed the body from his tomb and they put it somewhere else. This was after the Sabbath, so people would have gone back, they would have gone home, the crowds wouldn't have been around anymore, and it would have been much less of a problem for Jesus to be buried in a public
if I may just to clarify here, this would be, for chronological reasons in my mind, Saturday afternoon, they would be moving the body so that when Sunday people show up, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So Jesus is crucified on Friday. The idea is that he was buried like just before sundown, which is when the Sabbath starts on Friday afternoon. And then as soon as the sun is down on Saturday afternoon, evening, as soon as the Sabbath is over, then they remove the body from the tomb. That's why Sunday morning, when the women come, the tomb is empty.
Okay.
So Jesus' body has been disposed of in some mass grave. The women were busy on the Sabbath, so they followed where Jesus was buried on initially on the Friday evening, but they weren't around to see that his body had been removed on Saturday evening. So come Sunday morning, they are surprised the body is not there. It's kind of impossible to say how many women were actually there because the Gospels don't agree on this. But so I just say, like I try my best to make my account, but like you actually can't because the Gospels can't agree. But like, at least some women were there, and they saw that the tomb was empty, and so they were. And so the next element invokes the concept of bereavement hallucinations, which is a well-known psychological phenomenon of people experiencing the voice or even seeing the appearance of a recently deceased loved one. And this happens in quite a large proportion, like 10 to 30%, something like that, of people who've recently experienced a significant loss. So the hypothesis is that the baseline for a bereavement hallucination is quite high. And in this context, it's further triggered by seeing the empty tomb, because they weren't expecting that, and that was surprising to them, as well as the fact that they are confused about Jesus dying, because they thought that he was the Messiah. They didn't expect him to die. They're trying to make sense of that. They're very upset and confused. That triggered a bereavement hallucination. So this could have been just one of the women who went to the tomb. So then the hypothesis is, again, it's a little unclear from the Gospels what the order is here, but we have to pick something. So we'll say that the woman who, let's say it was Mary, one of the Marys, she went and told Peter that, oh, we went to the tomb and it was empty, and I saw Jesus there. And so Peter is excited. He's maybe a bit skeptical. He's confused. He rushes to the tomb, and he has a bereavement hallucination as well. So that's sort of triggered by the first hallucination. So he has expectancy at this point. So this is another psychological element. Expectancy is incredibly important, particularly when we're talking about triggering like hallucinations or other types of experiences. Expectancy has been shown in many contexts to massively shape what people experience. And like you can even do this if you just, one of the studies I cite, they put people in a sensory deprivation chamber. So they like cover their eyes and play white noise and remove all sensations. And I think they even like put gloves on them so they can't like feel anything. And if you do this, so it's been shown that even just doing this in general can lead people to have hallucinations, because we're sort of not really adapted to have complete sensory deprivation. But particularly if you give them a prompt beforehand, like, oh, you may experience something unusual, that significantly increases an amount of reported experiences that people have. So, and again, this is not to say that, Peter or Mary were in a sensory deprivation chamber, but just as one of many pieces of evidence that highlights the importance of expectancy. And this is an important part of my model, because the idea is that each event triggers the next, or at least significantly increases the probability. So you have empty tomb. And initially, it's essentially the events of the Gospels about the disruptive and potentially volatile trial and crucifixion of Jesus. That is what triggers, like it takes a long time and it's highly public and potentially volatile. That triggers the fact that of the need for the temporary burial. The temporary burial triggers the removal of the body, which then is what triggers the women to find the tomb empty. That plus the expectancy and the emotional saliency of the event triggers a bereavement hallucination in one of the women. They then tell Peter, which triggers a bereavement hallucination in him. He then goes back and tells the other disciples. Again, it's sort of impossible to tell the exact sequence, whether this is like the next day or a few days later, but the idea is that the main group appearances, I have a sort of a concordance of these that I tried to put together. The main group appearance that I think, let me rephrase that. The main group appearance that I account for directly in my model is that reported in Luke and John. I assume these are talking about the same thing, although it's sort of unclear, which happens when the disciples are in Jerusalem. They are together, And it reports, this is where we have reports of them like eating and seeing Jesus's hands and things like that. I think most of that's in Luke, but there's somewhat of a similar report in John. So according to my account, this what describes a real event in which the disciples were together in Jerusalem. Peter had already told them about his experience and finding the tomb empty and then having Jesus appear to him. That led to expectation. And I think that the actual experience the disciples had together was a collective experience, which I describe as sort of similar to like Pentecostal miracle, Pentecostal healing accounts. So there's some interesting literature that's been published on this. And one of the key mechanisms that I cite here is what are called self-reinforcing attentional processes. So this is something like, and this is an escalatory process. So it begins with a general expectation that something might happen. Also, the hypothesis is that the disciples have been probably fasting, they've been praying, they have been scouring the scriptures because they're trying to understand what happened. Messiah's not supposed to die. He's supposed to overthrow the Romans, right? So what's going on? This is very confusing. So that's the background here. These are not a bunch of scholars like carefully and logically thinking through the metaphysical implications of what's happened. They're like desperately seeking for anything to validate their faith. So people may have heard of cognitive dissonance. I think that there's some critics of exactly like that. But the basic idea that people try to avoid having to change beliefs in ways that are like unappealing to them, and that they cling on to beliefs, irrational belief persistence. Like that's well documented. So I think that that's a component here. They have expectancy that there's some answer coming because Peter saw Jesus, right? Tomb is empty, something's going on. So the idea is in that context, these self-reinforcing attentional processes then come to the fore. And this could begin with something like, do you feel that, brothers? You feel his presence here, right? And then that develops further. And then it comes into maybe, do you hear that? Maybe it's hearing his voice or hearing music or something, I don't know. And then maybe, do you see that? And whether that could be some sort of shadows or some like staring into the sun or something like this, or initially, and so whatever exactly it is, I mean, there's no way to possibly know, but we can speculate that the self-reinforcing attentional processes gradually feed off each other. As one person feels or sees or believes they experience something, they report this to others, which then creates an expectation in them, and then it goes back and forth, probably over the process of hours. And then at some point you reach a sort of a crescendo where then people are probably having individual hallucinatory experiences. It's important to emphasize at this point that I don't use the term group hallucination, which is generally a term that apologists use to denigrate the sort of account that I'm giving. And the reason it's important to be careful here is because hallucinations are sort of defined as a psychological private phenomenon. So you can't actually have a shared hallucination. But what you can have is simultaneous or like roughly concurrent hallucinations of similar things. And this has been discussed as well. I cite some sources in my book talking about this, how this can give rise to a belief that they experience the same thing when they subsequently then share this experience with each other. So there's the initial experience with the self-reinforcing attentional processes that leads them to report seeing and feeling all sorts of things. But that's not where it ends, right? And this is where apologists, I think, get it wrong. They seem to think that I need to then have the whole gospel account happen in that way. No. The idea is then they talk about it the next day and the next day and the next day, and the account grows in impressiveness. And if there's discrepancies, people are reluctant to mention them because they feel like, oh, I wasn't righteous enough, or I didn't have enough faith to like hear him say this particular thing or see his face here. Other people said that they did. But then, of course, there's a phenomenon called memory contamination, where people hear something and then they incorporate that into their own memory of the event. This has been documented in many contexts, and it's a very common source of false memories.
Somewhat like we see with the the Sinbad and the genie, and like people will conflate memories and think they saw stuff that wasn't there, and they call it what do they call that? The Mandela effect kind of thing.
Oh yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's many interesting phenomenon in memory research that are related here, that memory contamination is one of them, and confabulating details as well is very common. Now, this is particularly likely, and this is somewhere where apologists sometimes push back. Yeah, but we don't do this all the time. Like usually our memories are reliable enough. Yes, but there are certain contexts where they are less likely to be reliable. And one of those is in this sort of close-knit setting in which there is like a high emotional excitability and people have a strong bias towards resolving their uncertainty in a specific way. And what they're doing is the disciples are sharing with each other what happened in this initial collective experience for like probably weeks. They're constantly talking about this and going over it and trying to reconcile that with what they read in the Bible and how they think about Jesus, right? So it's not a disinterested a dispassionate reflective exercise. And at this point, no one's writing anything down either. It's likely none of them were literate. So this is all, there's no objective record of any of this. It's all them trying to come to terms with it in a highly sort of emotive, close-knit way. And we know that this is exactly the setting in which false memories are likely to develop. So the idea is not that they generated the memories from whole cloth. They came from an experience they had together, but then the account increases in impressiveness and it increases in coherence as details are confabulated as they're trying to recall things. And also people try to fill in gaps. It's funny, you can see apologists do this. When you ask them about something or some like discrepancy in the Gospels, they say, well, maybe it was this way. And they'll just come up with some ad hoc explanation. And we can document that because everything's like written down and recorded. But back in the day, someone may have come up with something like, maybe it went this way. And then that becomes, I remember it being this way. This is another thing that's been documented, that people can easily confuse imagination with memory, or in this case, it's like hypothesis with an actual memory. So all of these phenomena are occurring over the next few weeks. There may have been multiple experiences, or maybe there was just like a single one, which was later reflected on. I don't know. The other accounts in the Gospels. So there's an interesting phenomena, which I'm sure you've talked about before, which is the non-recognition motif, which we see in actually most of the Gospel accounts, where the one or more of the disciples see Jesus, but they don't initially realize who he was, which is really weird and unexpected. If Jesus was actually physically appearing to them, why wouldn't they recognize him? That doesn't really make any sense. I know people have different explanations for this. I just hypothesize that actually all of the non-recognition motif appearances, like the Road to Emmaus one, for example, they were all post hoc rationalizations. Essentially, like those events happened, but Jesus wasn't actually there. After the fact, after the collective experience that I mentioned that happens in Jerusalem, people are thinking about it and they're like, that weird thing that I felt, or that weird guy that we saw, like on the Road to Emmaus, they like had dinner with a guy and then it turned out to be Jesus and then he disappeared. Like, I think plausibly what happened, what we could hypothesize happened, is that part was confabulated afterwards, and they convinced themselves that it was actually Jesus when it really wasn't. And that explains why they didn't initially recognize him, because they're sort of adding on that element to the end of something else that actually did happen. So in this account, there's plausibly only one sort of like real collective experience, which is the disciples together in Jerusalem. And the non-recognition motif examples are sort of confabulations that happened afterwards, not maliciously, but people are trying to think about other things that had happened to them and other ways that they may have experienced Jesus in them, right? And so then they come up with these things that then they remember really strongly actually did happen to them. Now, there's one last element that I should probably mention, which is, why did these appearances cease, right? Why do we have the Pentecost and Jesus going up to heaven after after this time when he allegedly appeared to them? Apologists often mention this as something that's not well accounted by my model. Actually, I think it is. And so I point to the work of Rodney Stark, who has studied new religious movements, and particularly those that are based on some sort of revelatory truth, like that comes from a revelation or dreams or or angels or something like this. And he finds that consistently in all of these cases, there comes a point where there needs to be a way of controlling the revelation in order to control the doctrine and the development of beliefs. Because if anyone can experience a revelation, then there's actually no way to control the developing tradition. And this is not like a conscious thing. I mean, it could be, but it's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's just people realize, now kind of everyone is saying that Jesus is appearing to them, or like, how do we distinguish between the real ones and the not real ones? I mean, Christians today even still talk about this, right? But like this issue happens with any revelatory new religious tradition. And so some kind of theological or doctrinal belief develops in order to distinguish like the real ones from the false ones. It could be that only certain people can receive these experiences, or it could be there's a certain time. And in the case of the disciples, I believe that for whatever reason, don't know exactly why, but for whatever reason, they came upon this idea that, yes, there was this certain time and certain experience where they believed, possibly, I think, just from staring up at the sun and hallucinating there, which is a well-known cause of hallucinations, that Jesus ascended into heaven, and that this marked like the termination of his resurrection appearances. Now, subsequently to that, we do have people seeing Jesus, but that's theologically interpreted differently. It's not a resurrection appearance, it's like a visionary experience. And so the point is, my account the work of Rodney Stark can really understand why this is the case. There's a theological, it's not that there's actually a fundamental difference between these experiences if you just like were there at the time. The same mechanisms of like expectancy and self-reinforcing attentional processes and memory distortion. They can explain these different accounts, whether you think that it was like a resurrection appearance or vision or something else. It's just that theologically they're interpreted in different ways because it is useful and serves an important function to have a demarcator of when the resurrection appearances, that's the bona fide, like really important ones that give you an authority. That's when these end, and that was at Pentecost, right? The ascension. And this then leads to the final element, which is Paul, right? Because obviously Paul happens after this. And this is a point that's fascinating because my RHBS model doesn't say anything about Paul. You notice that I try to establish a step-by-step process how each element links to the previous one. Paul is not linked to this process at all. He wasn't a follower of Jesus, and he wasn't like involved in this in these events in Jerusalem. So I don't have an explanation for the conversion of Paul. I think that ones can be given, but I don't try to do that. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that this has come up in discussions with people before. The apologists seem to think that they do, right? They seem to think that Paul's conversion is strong evidence of the resurrection. And this is the thing that I find it most interesting of anything else. Because if you think about it for 5 seconds, it's just manifestly obvious that the resurrection doesn't have anything to say at all about Paul.
Right.
Paul is not a resurrection appearance. He didn't know Jesus. There's absolutely no reason you would expect Jesus to appear to Paul. It doesn't fit with any of the other things that we're told about him. Like, Jesus appeared to his followers as a way to vindicate to them and show their faith wasn't in vain, right? But Paul wasn't a follower. Why is he appearing to Paul? Paul wasn't involved in any of this. And it's not even clear if you look at the accounts that any of Paul's followers saw Jesus either. So there's a difference in the nature of the account, although I don't put too much credence in that. But like it doesn't really make any sense under the resurrection hypothesis. You have to invoke an additional postulate that, well, like God had just a really special reason to make Paul specifically, of all of the people on earth that he could potentially have appeared to, Paul specifically, he just had a really special mission for Paul, I guess. And in which case, if that is good enough for the apologists, I can just say, okay, well, some weird psychological thing happened to Paul.
Yeah, if I may, on the Paul thing, I've heard, and before we get into some other interesting things, this was fantastic listening to you really like do a genealogical explanation of how, if we take it at face value, we could explain this stuff. I've heard some people argue or mention, if you take like police officers, like prison guards who are guarding people who are in a really bad, unfortunate situation, they're being treated as animals, they're being abused in prison. You got a really tough cop who's just an asshole, right? And this seems to be a kind of Paul, right? He's out here trying to persecute the church. He's like going above and beyond, where he's causing himself anxieties, himself problems by harming other human beings. And then all of a sudden you have this has been like a phenomena documented even with prison guards, where they end up actually becoming very close to the people they were once harsh on in prison. And they connect now with the people that they were once harming, persecuting, and they end up becoming on their side. And so there's something psychological. I don't know what you would call that, but if the phenomena is the case that Paul's out here really doing real damage, hurting people, and something happens, I don't know. I mean, mind you, he's already completely primed within a completely apocalyptic Jewish mindset. So he's already kind of got the whole superstition hardware. Then he's hurting people. So he has this ethical grounding. Maybe he had a moment and now he's sympathizing with the people he was hurting. Maybe he had a psychotic episode and made
this
him go, whoa.
This is my point. There's a wide range of options and we just don't really have enough data to say what happened. I think that any of those explanations are quite ad hoc. But what I want to emphasize is just that the explanation that it's somehow accounted for by the resurrection is just patently illogical. The only way that you can account for it is to say God had a special mission for Paul, and that's just the way that God decided to do it. Because it's just not accounted for by the resurrection. Like I don't know how to say this any more clearly, that Jesus rises from the dead and appears to his followers. There's just no Paul there. Like there's nothing to do with Paul. There's no reason to think that, like, just invent anyone else in the world who existed at the time and ask, would Jesus appear to them? You're like, oh no, he wouldn't. Well, why would he appear to Paul?
Right.
There's no connection. And so I try to leave that sort of deliberately ambiguous to highlight the absurdity of apologists pretending that the resurrection accounts for, like explains the resurrection of Paul. And this actually highlights an important point. I think people too readily confuse consistency with explanation. the resurrection, the Christian account, is consistent with God appearing to Paul. That's absolutely true. It doesn't rule it out. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. It's consistent with almost any outcome, because you can just say, oh, God wanted to do it that way. God could appear to any subset of people on the planet, including like no people or everyone or any subset in between, and you could square that with the theology. Like there's no constraints. Now, notice that's not true for my model or anything like my model. If there are credible accounts of Jesus appearing in China at the time, my model is dead. Like it just cannot possibly account for that. Like at the same time, centuries later, yes, but at the same time, no.
Right.
So it is actually falsifiable in a way that the resurrection hypothesis is not falsifiable.
Right. Have you studied Simon, the one they call Simon Magus?
Oh, I've read a bit about him. Yes, he's an interesting fellow.
So this is actually interesting. There's a new book by, I just did the interview. I haven't publicized it yet. It'll be public here soon. By M. David Litwa, and it's on Simon and the Simonians is the academic version. He has a popular one he called Simon Magus. Simon, we get this glimpse in the same book that you get these visionary experiences by Paul. This guy named Simon Magus, he was a contemporary of Jesus. Well, when we see the heresiologists who are describing him, but we also have some writings from the Simonians, he claimed to be Jesus 2.0. He was God incarnate. He was not one of the original 12. So here you have another guy who's going further than Paul, who thinks he's God incarnate, who's a 2.0 Jesus, so to speak. And he gets this really, I would say, a heresiological account in Acts where they're saying he tried to buy the Holy Spirit. This guy predates Paul, according to the chronology. He's contemporary with Jesus, whereas Paul comes after. Yeah. This guy's like somewhere around there at the beginning, and they have to like throw poo on him in the Acts of the Apostles. And anyway, it's worth checking out. I just thought about that because I'm like, it's fascinating to hear you say, you don't even care to factor in Paul necessarily, that there are plenty of ways to explain this. They do come up with they think the only one is the divine one, or at least it seems most likely to them. Why do you think that is? What do you think the psychology is, since we're into psychology? Because I think this, and I get in trouble for this, James. They always say, quit psychoanalyzing me. And I'm like, well, I can't help it, man, because when I was a Christian, I know how my brain was thinking at the time. And now that I'm not, like, I can't help but play the tape back and think, yeah, I don't think I would have seen this either when I was 12 years ago, when I heard any of these arguments or whatever. I wouldn't have been persuaded at the time. What's the psychology you think behind the apologist in what's going on?
That depends on the extent to which you think apologists are genuine or sort of putting on a show. But I mean, I'm not going to say the apologists don't actually believe what they're saying. I think that sometimes they are not intellectually honest with all aspects and the weaknesses of their arguments, and I think that they are just sort of for show. But anyway, the point that I would make is that it's not usually. I don't think it's particularly helpful to say that someone is wrong on the someone's beliefs are false on the basis of like justified by an appeal to their psychological motivations or the psychological state, or you were raised to believe this or things like that. That's why I prefer to just adjudicate it on the basis of, okay, well, point to objective reasons that aren't just, it appeals to your psychological state as to why this explanation is to be preferred to the other. Mm-hmm. However, once you've done that, and if, as I argue, then they don't have very good answers, then I think it's plausible to say, well, let's speculate as to what might be going on in your mind, like the interlocutor's mind, that explains why you think this is plausible, even though you potentially can't articulate why it actually is. And so in the case of like why they find resurrection or like supernatural explanations generally convincing, this is an interesting area of psychology, which is how people assess the quality of an explanation. Something I'm quite interested in. I don't think we have a very good understanding of this. One thing that we know is that people judge things to be more plausible when they're more imaginable. So if they can vividly develop or like imagine a scenario of that playing out, kind of like watching a movie or like hearing a story or something like that. So that's why the Gospels are so powerful, because it's a story. Like it tells you kind of exactly what happened. I mean, the stories don't exactly align with each other perfectly, but that's fine. Like they all tell their own stories. As long as it sort of makes sense internally sufficiently, then that helps people to vividly imagine it, and that increases the plausibility. Another thing is that people confuse consistency with plausibility that I said before. So as long as the account is not inconsistent with something else, then they will misinterpret that as sort of thinking that it is supported by the account. Like, well, the resurrection doesn't rule out Paul as like an appearance to Paul, so it explains an appearance to Paul. Well, I mean, it manifestly does not, but because they've heard it so often, it's so imaginable to them. And it's that's the other thing, that people also just rate things more plausible when they've heard them more often. This is a technique behind propaganda. It's the big lie, right? You just say something often enough and people will rate it more plausible. This is one of the biggest failures of human psychology, in my opinion, actually. Like, the stupidest possible strategy. How can we convince someone of something? Just say it lots of times. That shouldn't work, but it actually, like, it's not foolproof. Like, it doesn't work on everyone, but it is surprisingly effective. So, like, the fact that for many people, they've grown up with this, even if they didn't grow up Christian, they've still grown up hearing these stories, and they've heard the Bible narratives, and either they grew up reading them or they started reading them often at a vulnerable time in life where they were receptive to some sort of message, right? So there's the fact that they've heard it many times. So it's something that there's familiarity. Then there's imaginability because of the vividness and the way the accounts are written, as well as media portrayals and images and other things, and artwork. There's a reason that art and music is so important in religion, right? It's because it helps a lot to really ground these things. And then the other aspect is that people don't know how to think very carefully about logical implications. They just sort of go with the vibe of an account. It's like, well, it feels like it sort of makes sense. And then there's this guy, Paul, and yeah, Jesus could appear to him. They don't think about, like, well, counterfactually, who else could he have appeared to, and why didn't he appear to those people? These sorts of questions often befuddle Christians when I raise them. It's like they've never thought of it before and they don't know how to think about it. Whereas it seems to me this is the first thing you should think about when someone's telling you this, that, well, what would this imply? If this were true, what other things would I expect to see about the world? And this is how we do, this is how we reason in science, in philosophy, and elsewhere. It's interesting. I've been watching some true crime YouTube things lately. And this is how the legal system works, or at least when it works well. That if someone is proposing, like, this person murdered so-and-so, they'll ask, like, what motives would they have had? If they wanted to do this and they had this opportunity, then why didn't they at this time? Or did they have the availability of this weapon or that weapon? Like, all of these logical elements are considered and brought up in trials, because, like, that's how you do reasoning. You try to infer what would likely have happened given a certain postulate. But somehow that sort of critical process is not activated in the religious context. And I think it's largely because people aren't used to doing that. You have to sort of put them in a context where they're encouraged to do that. Like, you put people in a jury and put them in that legal context and really encourage them to think through it this way. And people can sort of do it, right? But the church doesn't encourage them to do this. Apologists usually don't encourage them to do this. And so it's sort of hard work to think through all of these things, right? So I think that the imaginability and the familiarity then supersede these sort of critical aspects, and you just get people sort of going along with accounts that just sort of make sense to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dude, there's so much there. I was going to show you this here. If you haven't read it, it's
Theoxany.
Yeah, you know what theoxany is, right?
I do not.
Oh, no? So there's this idea of hospitality. Like, there's these ancient myths, ancient stories where a god is hidden in disguise, and the random person shows the deity in disguise. They don't know that it's an actual god. Hospitality. So there are lots of stories that go way. This goes all the way back to, like, ancient Canaan and Mesopotamian myths. We have it in Greek myths as well. You have this in Ovid's Metamorphosis with Philemon and Bacchus. You have this with Abraham. The three figures come. He shows them food. He gives them food and drink and lets them rest. And then, of course, one of them is God, and he didn't realize it's God that he's arguing with about the city. Eventually finds out, of course. Well, in this case, he's dealing with the Luke 24 road to Emmaus scene, and he argues that there's an intertextual dialogue going on between Luke 24 and the Odyssey, the Greek Odyssey. And when you break this down, it's actually mind-blowing to see how much of a pun is taking place, because the character in Luke 24, the name means glory of the Father. So Cleopas, which is mentioned as the two guys walking on the road, go, man, we thought he was the Messiah. And then Jesus shows up, and then he's really like talking with them. And he's like, hey, yeah, what are you saying? He's like, man, there was this guy. How do you not know? You're the only one in Israel who doesn't know that, there's this guy named Jesus, and He gets killed. We thought he was the Messiah. When he spoke, a fire burned within me. And then he's like, did you not know that he had to come to suffer and all this kind of stuff, right? And then, oh, wow. And then come stay with us. He comes in and, of course, breaks bread. And then, boom, they recognize him, disappears.
Yeah.
That is something that ends up happening in the Odyssey when Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, is running from the suitors. His life is in danger. His dad is off at war. He thinks his dad might be dead. And then there is Athena, described as his mentor, looks like a male mentor, and he's talking to him and going, man, I wish the gods, were here to protect me like they do my father far away. So he uses this term in Greek that's like, the gods help my father far away in the war in Troy. I wish they protected me, not realizing right next to him is a goddess. And
Yeah.
get this, the goddess says to him, oh, Telemachus. The name Telemachos literally means like fighter from afar. He says Telemachos, or she says in the text, Telemachos, the gods can protect you from far away, Mr. Telemachos, far away, fighter from far away. The name is a pun on the very thing it's saying in the text. Well, Cleopas in Luke means glory of the Father. And so he literally says to glory of the Father, don't you know that he had to do this for the glory of the Father, Mr. Glory of the Father?
Yeah, right.
And so it's like, so this is why I can't even get past taking it too seriously without recognizing this. And there are other ways in which we can explain it, but it's like, I like to bring in the fiction. I like to, because I know that they're playing this game. I know they're into it.
Well, particularly the non-recognition motifs are just, it might be sort of, I mean, this isn't my area, but it's just so clearly a textual motif, a flourish that's made by the writer for a particular purpose. Like, it's so bizarre, and doesn't fit with the hypothesized explanation of that there was actually a flesh and blood person who appeared to them, like following a resurrection. Why wouldn't they recognize him? Mm-hmm. So I totally agree, and I think that a lot of what's found in the Gospels can be explained this way. I don't wade into those debates; it's not my area of expertise, and the whole point is just to show, again, a different approach, which I think ultimately is complementary. I don't think that the stories were made up out of whole cloth. I think there were. That Jesus's disciples did have some kind of experience which prompted them to have these beliefs, but I don't know it. Like, is it what I said in my account? I don't know. I think that those things are plausible, but I also think that there's been a lot of mythology and a lot of textual interpretation layered on top of that. And I don't pretend to be able to disentangle what is what there. All I try to show is that, like, we can actually get quite a long ways, even just taking almost everything at face value, like pretty much everything that's not a miracle. I think that you can come up with a psychological explanation for that. I think you can come up with textual explanations for a lot of things as well. And the reality of what actually happened will be some combination of those things. But I think one of the reasons, apart from the fact that, again, I think that this aspect is underexplored that I've been talking about, is also that some people who are exposed to apologetics or follow apologetics, they just find different things convincing. So some people might be convinced by the textual analogs, right, and the Greek, the Greek mythology that is mirrored in the Gospels, and then the other aspects that you talk about. Some people just don't find that convincing, and maybe they would find more convincing the psychological aspects, or looking at contradictions in the Gospels. Like, there's different lines you can go down that just for whatever reason are convincing to more people than others, and so it's good to have a variety of tools for approaching this.
I 100% agree. By the way, there's a scholar. You might be interested if you've probably heard the name. You may already know this. I don't know. James Tabor. Have you ever ran into James Tabor?
I don't recognize the name, but I may have. I am not very good at remembering names, so I may have read but forgot.
This is a scholar that you might want to write the name down. Actually, you might be interested in it. It'll help your
position.
How do
you spell the surname?
James, of course, and then Tabor.
Right.
And he's written several books, Jesus Dynasty, all sorts of stuff. He's dealt with Paul. He's an ancient Mediterranean expert who also specializes specifically on the region we're talking about. Like, he has a broader, he worked with, like, he was a student of Jonathan Z. Smith, like really, really cutting, kick-ass scholar. And he believes there was an empty tomb. Oh, and cool. He postulated, now this might help you at least to give you some PhDs that are within the field that can credit, you can credit and say, hey, I'm not alone. And his hypothesis is this: the only difference with what you painted versus what I've heard him say is he doesn't throw Jesus in a common grave. He does think that they buried him in a new location. So it was a temporary location just because of the religious holiday, but they did relocate his body and buried him somewhere else. I don't think he dies on the hill necessarily, like they could have thrown him in a common grave, but if they were going to bury him at all, and grant him the opportunity to be buried, then why just go throw him in a ditch somewhere instead of like, hey, because they could have just done that the day of. They could have just thrown him in a ditch and said, hey, be done with it. So he would just go a little step further and say, well, no. They just relocated him because it wasn't his tomb into a more permanent location somewhere else. However, that you definitely can quote him for that, at least to have him
cool.
as, yeah, I wanted to give you some fodder for your position because he does think it's historical. He just thinks that they took it down, like you said, before the holiday was up. Yeah, I could think of some other, like I'm thinking of other things. Like, how do you approach the idea of making up? I know that's on the table too, like someone fabricating or inventiveness, because I'm not talking about just legendary stuff, which is part and parcel of writing literature, but I'm talking like Joseph Smith bullshit artistry in a sense. Like, where do you go with that?
Joseph Smith's an interesting case, actually. So I differ. It's been a little while since I looked at some of the details here, but I differ from a lot of critics of Mormonism. I mean, I consider myself one of those, right, as being an ex-Mormon. But see, I think that Joseph Smith was, I'm going to be careful how I frame that. Well, let me take a step back. I think that naively, we have a image in our mind or an idea of someone who is sincere and someone who is malicious, like they're deliberately fabricating something.
Yes.
What I would suggest is that it shouldn't be seen as a dichotomy, but somewhat of a spectrum, and even that's oversimplifying things. But basically, there's various degrees of self-deception and motivated reasoning that people engage in. And I think that Joseph Smith is an example where there was a lot of self-deception, motivated reasoning, but I don't think it's the case that he was straightforwardly just like maliciously and knowingly making up everything as a scam. I think that doesn't fit with a number of the facts and what we see in other movements as well. So I would apply this to the case of the disciples as well. I usually, again, just for the sake of the discussion, just to grant as much as I can, just assume that they're like well-intentioned and well-meaning and like not subject to, well, like they're subject to some cognitive biases, but they're not subject to like malicious cognitive biases or like deliberately doing anything that you might regard as like problematic. But in practice, they almost certainly was, right? So there's like, everyone knows when you're making an argument and you realize, this bit doesn't quite work, or like there's a bit of a gap here. Well, look, it's not that big a deal. I'll just sort of come up with a reference to put there, or like paper it over or minimize it in some way. Like everyone has done that to some degree when you're arguing anything, right? Because there's always some little weakness that you can't fully resolve and you just sort of try to minimize it, right? Like that is not really too bad, because often it's fine if your main point is substantiated. You can't completely do everything. But there's degrees of that, right? There's degrees of that which goes from just like not fully substantiating everything that you've said to like wholly making things up out of whole cloth and fabricating sources. And so the idea that we need to put everyone at one extreme of this, I think, is naive and incorrect.
I didn't mean to do that, and that wasn't my goal.
No, I wasn't saying that you were. I was saying that people, I think, often apologists present it as if it's this dichotomy. It's like, well, either they were liars or they were sincere. Well, no, that's just like that's not based on any psychology. Like the people are either liars or fully sincere and like unblameworthy.
I agree. I think you're right that there was an article written by Robert Price about Joseph Smith a while back called Liar. He called it Liar, Lunatic Lord. He did a C.S. Lewis on Joseph Smith.
Oh, that's cool.
And he walked away saying, I don't think he's one thing. I think he's this hodgepodge of a human. He's like all of us, where sometimes we bullshit, but then we also buy into our own bullshit and like we really believe, but we also, and so it's not either or. And then I wonder if we apply that to some of the stuff in the New Testament. Now, let me ask you this though, because we want to play. And Danny made a comment about Bart Ehrman. Danny, my friend, trust me, we understand there are different models here. I promise you. We get it. Dogs ate the body. For example, one might even just say, no, he was never taken down. Maybe the Gospels invented that he was even crucified at that time of Passover, because the Passover type language in Paul gave them the inclination to invent a legend that he died at the time of Passover. I mean, who knows? But at the end of the day, crucifixion was meant for the worst possible outcome, to have you agonize and suffer and die, and then a rotten corpse is in front of you. So the point of crucifixion wasn't to nail you up there for 3 hours and take you down. This is why all of this is questionable. All of this can be, questioned, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to emphasize one of the aspects of my account that I do try to emphasize. I mean, I could probably articulate this a little more clearly, is that I'm sort of assuming that there is, in the crucifixion, the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, there is a power conflict between the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities. Indeed, there may be multiple factions within those. So it's the Jewish authorities who are really seem intent on having Jesus crucified. The Romans don't seem super into this, right? They seem to be sort of going along with it. And they're reluctant because they're concerned about generating, triggering a riot. Because Jesus has a lot of followers, but also he has a lot of the Jewish authorities are very hostile to him. So they're trying to thread that needle. So the idea that what I do find a little bit too simplistic sometimes is people say, if the authorities were crucifying Jesus to humiliate him, so they wouldn't have allowed him to be buried, or they would have done this other thing. Look, maybe, I don't know, but I don't assume that there is one actor in that situation who has one set of intentions. I think It was a dynamic interplay, and I think this is really quite plausible from what we do know about it. If any of it is historical, there was an interplay between the interests of the Jewish authorities and the interests of the Roman authorities. And so the Roman authorities were willing, according to my hypothesis, were willing to allow Jesus to be, they had to crucify him because that was the law, but they essentially acquiesced to the request of the Sanhedrin to do this because they didn't want to piss the Sanhedrin off, but they also didn't want to piss off Jesus' supporters or anyone else in the crowd who might stir up trouble, right? So that's why, according to my hypothesis, they wanted the body removed, and they're either they allowed one of his followers to bury it, if you think that Joseph of Arimathea really was sympathetic, he offered, or they just impressed on him, look, we need this down. We don't want to leave it up there or just throw it in the common grave where everyone is around, because that will be too inciting when the emotions are really hot. We want this to lay low for a while, let the Sabbath happen, and then you can do whatever you want with it. So the idea is that it's an interplay between different groups, right? Am I saying that is exactly what happened? No, but I think that it is important to think about things from the point of view that there's always multiple actors trying to pursue their interests. And just like we were talking about, it's not necessarily simple of stories like one agent wanted this thing, and so then that happened. Often it's a complicated interplay.
Yeah, I want to ask you this then, because you get in the sandbox, and I like that. I like playing in the sandbox. I call it the sandbox because it's I can get in, I can also get out, and play in areas that aren't the typical areas of what most apologists would be willing to do. And
the important thing is to know what you're doing, I think, and tactically take the debate in a certain framing. And I think that it's absolutely important to do that from multiple different perspectives. So I absolutely try to emphasize every time that I'm not saying this definitely happened this way or this is the only way to approach it, but I think it's a useful framework to have.
That's why I was saying to Danny, I think Danny might have just showed up and thought this was our position. And it's hold up. Honestly, I don't know for sure what happened at all. And so I think that's the honest approach, is being much more cautious. But I'll tell you, I wanted to get your thoughts about this, because when Celsus, the critic of Christianity, is writing against the Christians, he's speaking to Jews. He's getting a lot of his information from Jewish authorities. He's learning from a lot of the educated competitors to Christianity. And they are obviously running with the idea that they did steal the body. Okay. This is not coming from Christian sources alone. This is Jewish sources that are telling Celsus against the Christians, they stole the body. Now we get this in Matthew. And I think that there might've been between Matthew's writing of his gospel, or Mark's writing of his gospel, and Matthew's added on, I would say, invented ending to his that is lacking in Mark, that wants to elaborate narrations of post-mortem appearances and such. You do get this story with guards that are protecting the tomb and trying to kind of keep tomb robbers from ever potentially stealing the body. So there's already a rumor, it seems, floating around, someone stole the body, right? We hear this. And, if we take it at face value, I hear apologists all the time say, there's no way in hell that's even possible, because they wouldn't have died for a lie. Frank Turek, William Lane Craig, the whole list goes on. Sean McDowell, they all say these kinds of things. And I'm thinking to myself, really? You know they wouldn't have motive to steal the body. Okay. And I want to throw a few things at you, and then I want to hear your thoughts. We just talked about bodies going missing and people becoming deified. They're already part of a cult. Let's just suspect we take face value. These guys were fishermen getting taxed on a lake in Galilee. They make nothing money-wise. Now they're cult leaders receiving funds from all over. They're now important figures. There's the psychology and there's income. All right. And now you're going to tell me that that's about to end? When they know if the body goes missing, it's even better for the idea of the trope that a deified person's body goes missing. The body goes missing. They have a story, and yet they could still potentially somehow mix this psychology in with the fact that they have power, they have money. And I don't want to put it all on bullshit, but I'm trying to say, like, maybe they took the body because they didn't want them to disrespect the body. Maybe they didn't want them to bury it in a common grave, whatever it is, but they stuck true to the story. The development happened, and eventually people start somehow believing in a resurrection. All right. They act like that's not possible for two reasons. They would never die for a lie is one of the main ones.
Yes.
And I'm thinking,
Very common.
Yeah, very common. What do you think about that hypothesis as a possibility?
Yeah, I actually think I should probably, I mean, I would need to devote some time to this. I think that it'll be interesting to develop an alternative account that is actually based on some amount of explicit deception. Because I think that that's actually quite plausible as well. I think I maybe still lean my current model a little bit more, but I don't know that there's a good reason for that. But anyway, let me just say some of the things I think about why that's plausible. So one is the notion that the body was stolen by disciples is like weirdly conflated with the idea that all of the disciples were involved in the deception.
Yeah.
And that need not be true. It could be like one or two of them who took it upon themselves to do this, and the others didn't know. And in fact, it's even possible that the others later told them, no, we moved the body because we didn't want the Romans to disrespect it or whatever. And they didn't believe them because at that point they'd already had experiences or whatever. Like, that's totally plausible that they didn't actually believe. So it needn't be all of them that did this, is one immediate response. A second response is that the idea, this is something I've been thinking about for years, like the idea people don't die for a lie. As far as I can tell, this is a truism that apologists like to say. I mean, there's many different counterexamples to this, which usually then the claim gets like further refined. It's like, well, first of all, we don't actually know that any of the disciples died for the lie. Like maybe Peter would be the best case, but most of them, we have no idea what happened to them. So they'll say, well, okay, but they at least were persecuted, right? We know they were persecuted, so they're willing to suffer for the lie. Okay, well, that's more plausible. We have more evidence for that. But also that's a lower bar. And people suffer for like false beliefs all the time, but then they say, yes, but they were in a position to know that this was true or not, because like they were the ones who would have been present in the case. So people don't die for a lie becomes people don't suffer for beliefs when they are in a position to know whether they're true or false, which is already a lot less sort of pithy. But the thing is that even that's clearly false, right? And I've been thinking of some counterexamples of this. And one, actually, probably the clearest counterexample is, I was mentioning some of the true crime stuff that I was watching. Some people plead not guilty and go through the trial process when the evidence against them is overwhelming. And in fact, even when they are offered a plea deal, which could, for example, avoid the death penalty or give them an opportunity for parole, but they still go through the trial. Like, obviously, some people don't. But if you think that any of these people are actually guilty and the evidence seems overwhelming in many cases, like anyone who doesn't take a plea deal or plead not guilty in a case like this where evidence is very strong and they are subsequently convicted is in a position where, like, presumably they're lying or at least significantly withholding a lot of information in the face of like suffering, where they could avoid suffering, even avoid dying in some cases. And so that's a clear case, I think, where people do die for it. Why do they do that? Well, maybe it's stubbornness, maybe it's pride. Like, who knows why people do that? It's hard to know. But this is the other thing that we talked about before, there's not a clear distinction between lying and being honest. There is a gradation of basically confirmation bias, believing your own lies and confusing yourself, like believing your own propaganda, so to speak, and self-deception. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I think that when what starts as maybe an innocent way of saying, maybe it happened this way, or look, I'm oversimplifying things, but I think that this is the important things that I'm sharing, right? It's okay that I'm oversimplifying it. And over time, that can become actually then believing those things or forgetting the origin of those points. And so I think that this simplistic notion of that the disciples wouldn't have concocted anything because they later were persecuted for it, assumes that there's no way that they could have convinced themselves or even convinced each other, because there's a group here. So they could have done different things, told each other, not believed it, forgotten who said what, and then the account sort of grows. Another thing that I will add is that it's, even from a purely like legalistic point of view, once you've blasphemed, you get stoned, right? There's no backsies, right? I mean, the Life of Brian, I think, does this really well. Like, even if they do say Jehovah, so like the idea doesn't really make any sense. Even if they said, "Oh, actually, no," like it depends who we're talking about. Because the Romans, they just wanted them to make the sacrifices, like they don't actually care. But like from the Jewish authorities' point of view, if you're saying this man was the son of God, like, well, you get stoned, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you change your mind. It's not clear that that would have prevented, or there would have been taken to be sincere, or that would have prevented any persecution. And this is often, I mention this because it's often a common reason, I think, why people do end up suffering for a lie. It's like people who establish Ponzi schemes and scams, where like, surely you knew you were going to get found out eventually. Like, you're falsifying all these books. A lot of interesting fraud cases where this happens. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. Eventually they're going to get caught out and going to be sent to prison. So why are they doing this? Well, probably because the hypothesis is they initially start out by just trying to fake it a little bit until they get something sorted out, right? Like, in the case of the disciples, it could be like, look, we're not quite sure what happened, but we'll say this because we think that that's probably right. Like, we think that he probably, I don't know, was raised by God, but like, we're still working it out ourselves. But we're going to say that as if it did happen when we're still working it out. So you treat a conclusion as if it's something that you experience directly, right? And then you, over time, get further and you get sort of deeper and deeper in, and it becomes harder and harder for you to get out while saving face. And it becomes more and more part of your identity, especially when you add in the prestige and the attention that the high position gets you. There's essentially no way out. And so people just dig themselves deeper and deeper into these lies. So I think that there's many interesting cognitive psychological aspects to this. But if you actually look at examples of like fraud or criminal justice or other new religious movements as well, like Joseph Smith you mentioned, it's just not really clear that this idea of like no one dies for a lie makes any sense, because there's not a clean distinction between deception and good intentions, and people can believe their own lies, and people could think that there's no way out and then just dig themselves deeper and deeper. And also, when you have a group of people, well, they're not all doing the same thing. So some people can think one thing, some people can think another thing, and then they can, the belief can take on a life of its own. And we don't know what the different disciples did at different times. And so we have a very low resolution picture of what was actually happening. So like, for all these reasons, I just find this to be a very unconvincing argument.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking about, and I was trying to see about finding the story where, let me see if it says this, not a completed drowning scene when he flows. So I was thinking about a story where Alexander the Great supposedly was swimming in a river. He was sick at the end of his life, and that he was going to float off, like where they wouldn't find his body. But again, I'm thinking of like bodies missing, and like, what is the point? How does that signal to the people that that person's divine and all that kind of stuff? And does that play into this Ponzi scheme kind of thing? I like how you brought up, it could have been one or two of them. And by the way, it wasn't just 12. According to the Gospels, he had several followers.
Yeah.
So maybe some other random, we've never heard of their names, people went and got him and did something. And then the 12 are told, oh my God, we went and checked it out and there's no body. He did rise. And like, again, they still could have stole the body. And yet it wasn't the ones who are sitting here having experiences. I mean, there's so many ways to look at this. And apologists just act like it's so ridiculous to even postulate some of this stuff. I love the examples you gave of true crime, because I like watching true crime too, and getting into the crazy cases of people that we're fairly certain did these things, and they are just standing there acting like nope, nothing, and they have opportunities to get themselves.
Yes, exactly. So clearly people do this. It gives interesting examples of when people just seem to keep digging themselves in when there are opportunities to come clean that would potentially help them. But I think that there's a lot of psychology that goes against that, hoping that you'll be able to figure it out, you'll be able to find a way out. I think often with like Ponzi schemes and frauds, this happens as well. Apparently this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Bernie Madoff, but like, I think the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. He was convicted of this, I think like 2009. Yeah, it blew up around the financial crisis, so it was around then. Huh. But from what I understand, it started out as like an innocent attempt to, because in a classic Ponzi scheme, you basically like, you pay out returns or dividends from newly invested money. and instead of any actual return on any actual productive enterprise. And so that is a way that you can have very high returns, but it's unsustainable because the only way you can fund it is to keep increasing the number of people who are participating. And he ran his entire investment portfolio apparently was just a Ponzi scheme for like 20 years. So he got all away with it for a long time. But apparently, the reason I mentioned this, apparently from what I recall, initially it started fairly innocently. Like he had cash flow problems and he wanted to maintain the high yield. So it's like, I'll just do it just this once. I'll just pay out some of these and then I'll get some money from other sources and we'll resolve it later. But then something new comes up and then he does it more and more and it gets worse and worse. And before he knows it, he finds himself in this position where he doesn't see a way out. It's not like he thinks that he's going to be able to get away with this forever. Maybe he was hoping he would die before it would be revealed. I don't know. He got close to it. Like he only died a few years after being convicted. But the point is like, that's not really rational. Like it's obvious that he's going to be caught eventually. And, but I think that people just dig themselves in and don't see a way out. Yeah. Another thing that I would point out, which comes to what you were saying about the attention and the status, is that social media provides some interesting case studies here where people will like film themselves committing crimes and then post this on social media for no obvious monetary gain. Why do they do it? Well, presumably because they like the attention. It's like online clout, right? Now, online clout is a modern phenomenon. But wanting attention and status is not a modern phenomenon. People have always wanted that. So the idea that like the status that the disciples had and like Paul subsequently had in the church was like somehow psychologically irrelevant to them, that wasn't important to their identity or their motivations, has always seemed ridiculous to me. Now, that doesn't mean that they make up everything whole cloth, right? Again, there's this sort of spectrum. But I think that it is an important factor in meaning that they're much less likely to admit any counter evidence or to be skeptical of things that would be confirming of their worldview.
I think that is so underappreciated what you just said. And I'm not saying it as I know, but when you're talking about, see, I think the problem is they're the ones shooting themselves in the foot. The William Lane Craig, being the William Lane Craig and all these guys who act like, oh, how silly. They're being sophist. They're literally standing there pretending like there's no plausible, they would never. And it's like, what? Like, here they are, their authorities. Paul's literally gaining money all over the empire to bring to Jerusalem, to them. He's funding them. And in fact, what's funny about Paul, if we go to 1 Corinthians 15 and we just read carefully, I'll even pull it up because this is actually really interesting to me. I read this and it sounds like locker room talk. This guy is, it's the most famous resurrection. Let's listen to the appearances. Look carefully at this. This is really got my brain. Where's it at here? Here it is. It's got my brain wrapped around it. And I've had a lot of scholars, by the way, PhDs who experts in this who go, you know what? That's interesting that you observed that. We know this, right? The gospel in vain, blah, blah, blah. For I received what I passed on. We know the appearances, right? Now, this is what's interesting. After the 500 and the 12 and the Cephas and the James and the apostles and all that, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, Paul's talking, he appeared also to me as to one abnormally or untimely, depends on the translation, born. For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, listen to this. I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Tell me he's not flexing to the readers. Like, look, these guys are the G's. These are the OGs up here. No doubt. I have to bow. We're getting money. We're collection for the Jerusalem. I understand that he's forced to have to reconcile with the Jerusalem church in these letters, but I worked harder than all of them. Bro, it's so human and so obvious. There's competition. And even when you go to 1 Corinthians 9, I think it is. Let's go back to 9. Where he talks about they get paid and they have wives, not I. Paul's writes as an apostle. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Same book. I have not seen the Lord, Jesus our Lord. Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Man, he's pissed off. What's going on, dude? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to the food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas. Tell me that's not drama, literal drama and beef going on, and Paul's trying to flex.
It all depends on the tone you read it with.
Well, I think when you see he worked harder than all of them.
No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that, well, I'm saying that if you approach this from a certain mindset, you just don't see those sorts of things. And this, I can really emphasize with this a lot because of my experience with Mormonism, right?
Yeah.
When you read accounts of Joseph Smith that are like sanctioned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he is, I mean, you know, he's a man, he's not supposed to be divine, but he is treated with immense respect, right? And the idea that he did sort of anything wrong, even though like we acknowledge that everyone sins, but like that's sort of, it feels awkward. Like you don't, it's a bit icky to even raise that possibility. He's placed on a high pedestal, right? Same with, and it's similar in Christianity with like Paul and other people like that. We may acknowledge in some abstract sense that like, you know, they're human, they make mistakes, but we have a very high pedestal for them when we are approaching them from a faith perspective, from as a believer, and making that shift to like then reading about Joseph Smith from secular sources or his earlier life, or as parts of it that aren't shared by the church, like that he was a treasure hunter, for example, which the church traditionally didn't talk about. I don't know if they do these days. They're forced by the internet to be a little bit more open than they used to be. But the point is, like, it's hard to put into words. You just see it in a totally different light. Like you read it and it's written in a different way and it emphasizes certain things. Some of the facts might be the same. Some of them are new things. And you're just like, oh, this was kind of like a weird, scummy dude, like not necessarily a complete charlatan. I don't think he was. I think there was a combination of motivations, like I said before, but like clearly he had a bunch of weird ideas and like was involved in a lot of sketchy stuff. And like, I just don't see him. I see him completely different to how I saw him when I was a Mormon, even without like, and in the case of Joseph Smith, it's not like he was a fictional person, like he was a real historical person.
Right.
And many of the same events in his life are the same, right? But it's just, you add some extra context and then look at it through a different lens. And what seems like to be someone who is beyond reproach, essentially, is now like, very much like we approach kind of anyone else in history, like, well, a complicated person and some good things and bad things. And like, you can see, well, these aspects are not so savory. And like, we can criticize here that they had too much ego and whatever else.
Right.
And like, when you're looking at the Pauline, when you're looking at Paul's letters from that angle, like it makes perfect sense, right? Like, well, obviously, like we know that there was some beef between Paul and the other disciples. That's not even like the Christians acknowledge this, but they sort of like try to paper over that in a way that I think just tries to de-emphasize how very like human and kind of nasty it probably was, or how much ego there probably was there. And from an outsider, or like I should say a non-believer then looking in, it's sort of easy to see, like, obviously there was a lot of motivated reason going on. And like, obviously we shouldn't put these people on some sort of pedestal, like, oh, like there couldn't have been any motivated reason, or like they would have only been maximally honest and like careful in their evaluation of sources and things like this. But that's just ridiculous. We know that most people aren't like that. People are self-serving and they're really sloppy when making arguments, and beliefs can be spread without any evidence at all. I mean, that should be very clear in the contemporary world. But Christians, I think, have there's sort of a halo effect. I mean, this is actually a known phenomenon. It's called the halo effect, where if someone is attributed to having some sort of good properties, or they're intelligent or good looking or something like that, or they have high status, you attribute positive characteristics in other areas. Like this is commonly why you have someone who, like, you know, the Nobel Prize phenomenon, where they earn a Nobel Prize and then they start spouting off nonsense in areas that they're not an expertise on, because everyone like takes them seriously now, or like celebrities who do sort of similar things. But the thing is that taps into this aspect of human psychology, where we sort of smooth over the specifics and just like, oh, this is a good person or a reliable person. We don't treat them with the same sort of skepticism or critical eye as we do to people whom we don't put on that pedestal. And particularly in a religious context, I think it's even more severe. So there's an unwillingness, I think, on behalf of apologists to really grapple with the fact that there's no reason, unless you're already a believer, but the whole point of apologetics is you're not going to assume that you're not going to make those assumptions. It's supposed to be convincing to people who aren't already believers. There's no reason to make such favorable assumptions about like their motivations and their psychology, because that's just not how people are. Why would we expect that these people are like that? I will sometimes make those assumptions purely for the sake of argument, to show that even if you make these sort of heroic assumptions,
Yeah.
it's still like the resurrection is still a terrible explanation. But I think that it's also absolutely important to emphasize, like, it's not reasonable to say, like, oh, the disciples were all entirely well-meaning and like wouldn't have done anything, like covering up evidence that it wasn't convenient for them, or like acting against each other in various ways, or like trying to squash dissent of people who disagree with them, or things like this.
I wrote an article a while back. It's on Academia. It's the only one I published. It's called the minimal. I called it the minimal doubts argument, and it's using an internal kind of what you're doing with this whole face value entering the sandbox kind of thing, and it's internal evidence in the Gospels that give all of us reasons to doubt. And I pull on this thread of doubt from the women went and told no one, for they were afraid, to the episode on Matthew 28 that they're on the mountain and it says he's there, that resurrected, supposedly appearances, yet some doubted. And they're right there and they're seeing the resurrected Lord and some doubted. Have you looked at that passage before?
Yes.
Yeah. And so they got them, some doubted, and then and then it pulls its thread all the way to Thomas and they break the fourth wall. And I'm pretty much trying to say that within the biblical text, it is encouraging you, the reader, you should have every reason by reading this to doubt. Well, I want to apply that to what you just said to say, is there internal evidence for why we should not trust the characters? Peter denies his own Lord 3 times, right? Like, you have people who are betraying him. You have all sorts of reasons, I think, internally, context clues based on the characters that we find in there, to think maybe these guys aren't as trustworthy as you would imagine and would maybe pull something like this. So I think that's a funny thing that most Christians will never do, like you said, for the halo effect, but they apply the halo effect to a text, to a religious kind of system that has Jesus painted, pure, apostles, all of this just miraculous. It all's perfect. And it got to us today. And I think that's unfortunate that there's some blinders on. That's what I meant by the psychology of the believer, because I remember being like that. And there was no way in hell you were going to tell me that I couldn't trust these guys, or I couldn't believe Jesus was like perfect and all that thing. It was just no way. Anyway.
Yes, and I think that this comes back to what I was saying before about how people assess the plausibility of different explanations, and familiarity is doing a lot of work there, because if you're so familiar with an account and thinking about it in a certain way, it's just very hard psychologically to see it from a very different perspective. It's like, well, what if these guys were not really all they were cracked up to be? Like, they're a bit sus, like they're a bit dubious in how they played with the evidence, for example, or they weren't too concerned about exactly which version of the events was written about in the Gospels, for example. Like, maybe they didn't really care as long, because the apologists often talk about how they were carefully controlling the stories as they spread around to make sure that they were accurate, which is sort of hard to reconcile with what we end up with in the Gospels. But like, the point is, even if they had that level of control, which I think they probably didn't, there's just no real reason to think that they were that concerned. Like, most Christians these days don't care about these particular details. Why would we think that the disciples were any different? What they were concerned about, I think, is their status and ensuring that the faith was propagated in a way that they thought was right, which is consistent with like their status as well. And there's an element of self-serving, then there's an element of genuine belief in like, this is the right thing. Most people are motivated by the combination of those things. So I think that that's a reasonable baseline. That's what they were concerned about. The exact details of what it said in the Gospels, I don't really see why they would care about that. Now, you can argue differently if you think that there's evidence for that. But like, the point is, the apologists just appeal to this as if it's sort of taken for granted. And I think that that's appealing to a Christian audience, because they're used to thinking like that. The disciples were good people. They'd be really concerned about the truth, and they wouldn't just paper over things or embellish or anything like this. They're not used to thinking of it that way. And if you try to encourage people to think that way, I think that they just kind of won't. Or it'll be rejected as implausible. And people will then, I think, come up with ad hoc justifications for why this wouldn't have happened. Like, people don't die for a lie, which, like, if you think about it, is sort of obviously not true, but it sounds convincing. And so again, that's an example of what's sometimes called a thought terminating cliche. You probably heard that term before, where it sounds pithy and convincing, but it doesn't, and it stops you from thinking, but it's not actually like very logically sound. Apologists are good at using these as well. So I think that's to sort of wrap things up a little bit. The way I see it is, in trying to break through to people who have been exposed to this sort of Christian upbringing / apologetics combination of things, It's very individual as to what will be convincing to particular people. I like crack through this. Again, I'm not saying that I'm trying to like deconvert people. What I want people to do is be able to have a good faith, critical analysis of what they believe and have good reasons for believing it. If they've done that and still end up kind of where they are, then well, power to them, right? That's up to them, and everyone has to be honest with themselves. But a lot of people have not done that, and I think that it's really important that we do promote critical thinking and approaching things from looking at it from a diversity of perspectives and really considering all the relevant evidence. So that's what I want to try to do. And so to do that, you have to get through a lot of these barriers where people just won't engage, or they'll only engage superficially to try to sort of like ward you off. And I think apologetics often encourages that. It encourages not actually thinking carefully about what you believe, but just like coming up with sound bites that sound like you've owned the skeptic, or like questions that they can't answer kind of things. So in order to crack through that barrier, different approaches will be effective in different cases. And I think that you just sort of need to actually listen to what someone is saying. That's really important, where they are coming from, and then have a range of approaches available to deploy. And so this is what I was saying before. Sometimes it might be the internal inconsistencies. Sometimes it might be like textual comparisons with the Greek myths or other sources. Sometimes it might be the psychological aspect, whether that's deception or hallucinations or other elements, or comparing to other miracle claims in different religious traditions. There's many elements that can be potentially relevant to assessing how plausible is this belief that the Christians are telling us, that this was actually, God incarnate raised from the dead. There's many elements that are relevant there. And I think that some are just going to be more convincing to some people and others less so, for sort of unclear reasons, idiosyncratic reasons. That's why it's important to have a diversity of approaches. And I try to sort of advocate for the sort of psychological based approach, because I think that it's been relatively neglected and sort of important when we're thinking about why people behave in certain ways and motivations. And it highlights a number of important points, like that we do need to be skeptical about our memories and our perceptions, because often they can mislead us. Like, they can be reliable in some cases, but not in other cases. That's a broad point that I think is important for people to grapple with. And and I think it's often people hold on to spiritual or religious beliefs because they feel validated in subjective ways. William Lane Craig defends this, right? Like, you can know by the Holy Spirit. This was how I was taught to validate Mormonism, or like the belief of Mormon doctrines, as you pray and the Holy Spirit will burn within you kind of thing. I think this is a really terrible way of finding out what's true. And I really want to push back against that. And so the idea that, look, our perceptions, our thoughts, our memories can be unreliable, and we need to have more objective ways to try to assess whether what we believe is true. So I think it's also beneficial from that aspect, that there's sort of a meta component there. So that's why I think that it's sort of important. It's not because it's the only way to approach these things, but I think, it's really important to have a robust, thoughtful pushback against the apologetics, because otherwise it sort of dominates the discourse. And I think that I think it's important to have an alternative to that.
I'm thankful for that. I really hope people will check out your YouTube channel real quick as we're closing out here. Not that. Your YouTube channel. We want to get these numbers up. I hope as people are watching this and trickling in over the next day or 2, 3 days, however long YouTube pumps this thing out there, people go subscribe and help you support what you're doing. You're trying to bring them education. You're a very smart guy. I really appreciate you bringing your insights, and your book, Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. I really find this fascinating. You're willing to go and play that game and really take them where they're at. And a lot of times, there's a talking past each other, because I don't usually get in the sandbox with them, because I'm like, sorry, I see this is not a sandbox. This is cat litter, and that's cat poop that you're standing in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to tell you, get out of the box and let's talk about, the way I would treat other literature, because that's the other thing. You're reading ancient material, but somebody's got to do the dirty work. And it seems like James wants to do that dirty work. And I'm glad he's doing it, because we need people who are doing this kind of stuff. Would you tell us a little bit more why people should check out the book and go subscribe to you?
Yeah, sure. So the book is a comprehensive analysis of Craig's apologetics. So Craig's written a lot about theology. I don't really discuss that there, but his apologetics, it's really a comprehensive coverage of everything that he's written up to 2018, which is when I published that. So a large part of the book discusses the Kalam cosmological argument. I should say, by the way, if you do have a look at the book, the first thing that I discuss is the Kalam. That's what Craig did his first PhD on, and it's probably what he's best known for. And I start by talking about philosophy of time, which is important to the Kalam. If you find that a little bit hard going, you can just skip that section, right? Like I'm sort of reluctant to start the book that way, but I think it sort of there's a reason for it. But anyway, the point is the chapters are modular. So each one can be sort of read independently of the others. So if you're interested in the Kalam cosmological argument about the origins of the universe and how God relates to that, you can check that out. I think that I have some particularly interesting things to say about that, particularly because I do like, as you say, like to take this approach of entering the sandbox, so to speak. So for example, I address the question of like, suppose the universe did have a cause. Does that mean that cause would have to be God? Because a lot of people just say the Kalam is like the universe began to exist. If it began to exist, it had a cause, and that cause was God. So therefore God exists, right? Most people just focus on the first two, like did the universe begin or did it have a cause? But I think it's just as important to consider, well, why does that cause have to be God? Because there's actually a lot of other possibilities that it could be. And when you unpack that, it really, I think, illustrates how the explanatory power of theism really unravels, because Craig really just has to invent all of these reasons to why it has to be God. He has to make all these ad hoc postulates, in my opinion. It's the same when it comes to the fine-tuning argument, which I discuss, I think, in the next chapter, where, again, I say, like, I don't think that there is fine-tuning, and the fine-tuning has been established, and I go through some sort of alternate ways to think about that. Then I talk about, well, look, suppose that that the universe is fine-tuned in the way that Craig says. Does that mean that God is a good explanation? And I talk about how I don't think that's the case. Resurrection chapter, we've talked about that. I discuss his moral argument and how Craig's moral argument is just an absolute joke. It's just so poorly constructed that I think it's just the least serious of his arguments. And the last chapter goes through a few other lesser arguments, like the appeal to mathematics and things like this. So it's quite comprehensive. You don't need to know anything about Craig to read the book, because I try to explain his arguments fairly concisely and then step through and talk about where I think the weaknesses are. So I think it's broadly, the thing is, this is directed at Craig, but honestly, especially when you're dealing with like evangelical Protestants, the arguments that most of the others give are just repackaged versions of this. Like they don't actually vary very much. And so if you read this, and you're going to get a fairly good introduction to like a lot of Christian apologetics. Catholic, it can differ a little bit, or like the precept is a little bit different, but like a lot of the sort of mainstream, like evangelical evidential apologetics is pretty well covered by this book, in my opinion. So I think it's a really good introduction to how approaching that from like a skeptical sort of naturalist standpoint. And in terms of my YouTube, I have, I sort of started the YouTube just a couple of years after the book. So I sort of developed similar ideas. So my thinking particularly about like the resurrection and the fine tuning has evolved a little bit over the years. It's still pretty similar to the book, but I've developed further ideas. So if you click on videos, the top tab, which is the pre-recorded ones, I've got some there like about the resurrection argument, about fine tuning, which are like edited videos where I go through and discuss a lot of material that's in the book with also some additional recent thoughts that I've had about. And I think that those are quite good resources. So you can check those out there. In the live videos, they're more like, and there's a few re-uploads there as well, but in the live ones, I do more like some discussions as well as reacting to apologetic content and having discussions with people who challenge me on various things. So it's not all religion, but like most of it is. So if those sorts of things are of interest to you, yeah, please check it out.
Absolutely. Go subscribe to James. Get his book, Unreasonable Faith. And James, I hope to see you back here. Maybe we do a call-in show or something at some time and take some callers from Christians and get challenged.
Yeah, it could be fun. Thanks very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, like the video, comment down below, share it with a friend on social media, especially a Christian friend who's probably thinking, there's nothing that could ever challenge my ideas. I like to challenge. I like to be challenged. And I hope that we can encourage more people to think about why they think what they think. And until next time, never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.